Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, too, for those joining from the West Coast. My name is Greg Orton, and I'm with the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. We are a coalition of 37 national organizations working to elevate the voices of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities at the federal level. Thank you all for joining us today to hear about the results of the 2020 Asian American Voter Survey that was led by AAPI Data, APIAVote, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Since social media rules everything around us, we're encouraging folks to use the hashtags AAVS for Asian American Voter Survey and hashtag AAPI 2020. For press, feel free to post your questions in the chat box, and we will try to answer as many of those through the course of the first panel or at the end, where we hear from the survey leads. And there will be additional question time at the end of the second panel, where we'll hear from a number of Asian organizations for their perspective. Really important, because during this time where we see polling data everywhere, we know that Asian Americans are largely forgotten, overlooked, or ignored. That is why NCAPA earlier this year released its policy platform to provide a comprehensive set of policy priorities for the community. And now with these survey results, we aim to change the common refrain Asian American community stands on the issues that impact us. And that is because we approach one of the most consequential elections of our time, all while navigating a very real pandemic and a country that struggles to realize the promise of racial justice. And we Asian Americans believe that we should not only be heard and seen, but we also have a role to play. Always a pleasure to introduce our friends at API Data, Karthik Ramakrishnan and Janelle Wong. Guys, go ahead.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you everyone for joining us. We have a lot of data to get through today, so I'm just going to be pretty quick in how we go through it. Thank you, Janelle, for advancing. Next slide. So in terms of background, Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the country. Pacific Islanders are not too far behind. Record high turnout in 2018 we saw for the midterm elections. And given the high levels of voter enthusiasm, we predict record high turnout for a presidential election in 2020. Asian Americans are of growing importance in many competitive states and in congressional districts. In Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan for the presidential. Many congressional districts, including in Southern California, Texas, New Jersey, as well as other states. Importantly, immigrant voters, if you look at naturalized citizens who are eligible to vote or are registered voters, there are about as many immigrant voters that are Asian American as Latinx. And that's just important in terms of media coverage. Many times folks will, either those in the media or in elected office, will talk about immigrant voters and Latino voters as synonymous. And we need to make sure that Asian Americans are included in that picture because they're about the same size. Language need among Asian Americans is actually higher than among Latinos, and that's also important. We'll hear about that later on today. Finally, despite significant diversity by socioeconomic status, we see remarkable solidarity on many issues around themes of inclusion, social safety net, and racial justice. Next slide. And Janelle, I think you can just click on it so that, because I can't see the bottom, just go to the previous one. So that, because I can't see the bottom of it when you're hovering over the things. Thank you. So in terms of the 2020 Asian American Voter Survey, we have about 1,600 registered Asian American voters. It's a national sample that includes Chinese, Filipino, Asian Indian, Korean, Japanese, and Vietnamese registered voters. Together, they account for about 85% of the Asian American registered voter population. In the past, we've added samples of other Southeast Asian voter populations as well as Pacific Islanders. Given the prohibitive costs and limited fundraising, unfortunately, we were not able to do that this time. The survey was conducted by telephone as well as online and fielded from July 4th through September 9th. Next slide. In terms of the sample sizes, you see those here. By the way, the slide deck, as well as the survey top lines and crosstabs will be available on all of our sites, including API Data, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, and APIAVote. So the survey samples, you see them there. The key findings are that Asian Americans are highly motivated this year. You see high enthusiasm, but many are still persuadable, but they're not getting contacted by either party. So it's a missed opportunity, and with less than 2 months to go, an important thing to flag. Among those who have made up their mind, they favor Biden over Trump by about a 2-to-1 ratio. Indian Americans tend to be strongest on Democratic identification and voting across the board. Vietnamese are the only large Asian American group that are currently favoring Trump over Biden, although by not a huge margin. In terms of major issues, economy, healthcare, education, and racial discrimination are top voter concerns. On the economy, Republicans are slightly favored, but on all other issues, there's a strong advantage for Democrats among Asian American registered voters. On a range of issues, Asian American voters are progressive, and we're flagging issues like immigration, racial justice, gun control, and environmental protection. Finally, impacts of COVID-19 are apparent not only on concerns about racial discrimination, but also on healthcare, unemployment, and financial well-being. Next slide. So in terms of voter enthusiasm, on all these slides, you'll see in all caps the Asian American average, and it might not be at the top. Usually it'll be somewhere in the middle. And what we'll do in the interest of time is to talk about the Asian American average and then the highest and lowest group for each slide. Again, these will be available offline for you so that you can dig deeper into the data as well as the detailed crosstabs. Asian Americans, majority, are more enthusiastic than less enthusiastic. And if you look at Filipinos, they are the highest, Asian Indians not far behind, Chinese Americans the lowest, but even there, 47% more enthusiastic. Next slide. In terms of how people are planning to vote, you see that 23%, actually 17% for Asian Americans say vote early in person, 8% vote absentee, 46% intend to vote by mail, only 27% intend to vote in person on election day. And you do see some variation by ethnicity here. Next slide. Party identification. This is what we see pretty regularly now. This pattern is consistent, where you have about a 2-to-1 ratio of the Asian American average in terms of Republican to Democratic identification, but you almost have about a third that identify either as independent or do not identify with either party. Vietnamese Americans are more likely to identify as Republicans than Democrat, and Asian Indians tend to have the highest Democrat to Republican ratio favoring the Democratic Party. Next slide. In terms of contact, however, you see, even though you have high voter interest and you have a relatively large population that does not identify with either party or identifies as independent, we find that only 12% of Asian American registered voters say that they've been contacted a great deal. If you combine those who've been contacted some, that's only 30%. Indians and Japanese Americans are more likely to say they've been contacted. Chinese Americans, the least likely to have been so. Next slide. Similar patterns with the Republican Party, Japanese and Indian Americans most likely to be contacted, Chinese Americans least, and very low contact overall. Next slide. Contact by community, similarly. Now, community organizations do not have nearly the same kind of resources that political parties and campaigns do. And again, you do see some variation with Indians this time and Filipinos at the top, Chinese Americans near the bottom. In terms of vote choice, next slide. First, we have results for the House race. You see about, again, a 2-to-1 ratio favoring the Democratic candidate over the Republican candidate. So 53% of Asian Americans, that's the average you see in all caps, favoring the Democratic candidate, 28% favoring the Republican candidate. Still 15% undecided. Asian Indians are the most Democrat leaning, whereas Vietnamese Americans are favoring Republicans among those who've made up their minds. Next slide. Senate race, similar kind of patterns, although it's a bit more even. One thing you should note is that the Senate races are not national this year. So California, which represents about a third of Asian American voters, does not have a Senate election this year. So that will skew the numbers just based on which states are having Senate elections. You do see a more even fight there with 46% favoring the Democratic candidate, 34% the Republican candidate, and Filipinos and Indians at the top and Vietnamese Americans strongly favoring the Republican candidate. Again, please note that California is not included this year in Senate races. Next slide. On the presidential horse race, this is probably the biggest number that everyone's going to latch onto. So let's just spend a minute on this slide. Asian Americans overall favor Joe Biden over Donald Trump by a 54% to 30% ratio. 15% are still undecided, and that's higher than we see for the national average. So this is still a very persuadable constituency. Among ethnic groups, Asian Indians are the strongest supporters of Joe Biden by a 65 to 28 ratio. And Vietnamese Americans are the only group where they favor Trump over Biden right now, but with 16% still undecided. So there's still a fair amount of room for persuasion. For all other ethnic groups, however, you see Biden favored over Trump among Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, and Filipino Americans. And this is important because there's been a lot of speculation, for example, with the Filipino American community and the Chinese American community in terms of how they will vote. Next slide. In terms of favorability, generally speaking, Joe Biden is favored, although it should note that it's more on the somewhat favorable than the very favorable than we've seen in the past, especially say with Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. Indians have the highest favorability for Biden, and Vietnamese Americans have the lowest favorability for Biden. Next slide. For Donald Trump, you see a lot more red, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So Donald Trump's unfavorables, including the very unfavorables, are very high among Asian American registered voters. 47% hold a very unfavorable opinion of him, 12% somewhat unfavorable. Total, only 35% hold a favorable opinion, with 19% holding a very favorable opinion. Vietnamese Americans have the strongest favorability, followed by Filipinos. And interestingly, Chinese Americans have the lowest favorability. So all of the talk about Chinese Americans for Trump suggests that it's an exception rather than the rule. Next slide. In terms of policy priorities for November, next slide. Jobs in the economy are near the top, followed soon by healthcare. It depends on how you measure it. So you see 56% say it's extremely important, 35% saying it's very important. Vietnamese much more likely to do so, and this is probably in line with data which shows that they're particularly vulnerable to the economic downturn, with many of them working in personal care services. Japanese Americans are the least likely to say that it's extremely important. Next slide. Healthcare. This is something that's going to be a recurring theme. Even though many people think of this as a COVID management election, just as in 2018, this is a healthcare election. In fact, if you just looked at the extremely important, that is the top issue. In fact, they're about a tie, given the margin of error. Vietnamese Americans and Indians are at the top in terms of ranking it as extremely important. Korean Americans at the bottom in terms of ranking it as extremely important. Next slide. Education is a significant issue. Later on, we'll talk about affirmative action, but it's not just about affirmative action. What we've seen in the past is people care about the quality of education, access to education, affordability of college, and college debt. These are all bundled under this notion of education. And that's important for folks to realize, because if you look at which party they favor on education, they in general favor Democrats over Republicans. So despite all the news headlines saying that affirmative action might be the only Asian American agenda on education, it does not reveal itself either in this data or in past data that we've seen. Next slide. In terms of which party is doing a better job on these top issues, as I said, the Republicans have a slight edge. It's actually within the margin of error. So it's about even. Japanese Americans give the Democratic Party a much bigger edge, followed by Asian Indians. Vietnamese give Republicans the edge on that. Next slide. Healthcare. Democrats have a very large advantage. So if 2020 is seen as a healthcare election, the way 2018 was, Democrats have a big advantage here. We do ask about party and not about the candidates themselves. Next slide. Education. So this is what I had flagged earlier. About a 2-to-1 ratio, Democrats to Republicans being favored, including among Chinese Americans. So this again is to reiterate that even though affirmative action might generate a lot of noise and attention, there's a lot more to the education agenda, when it comes to Asian Americans than affirmative action alone. Next slide. Racism and discrimination. This is a significant issue, not at the very top, but pretty close to being at the very top. And Asian Americans strongly favor Democrats over Republicans on this issue, with Korean Americans and Indian Americans particularly sensitive, but Japanese Americans not too far behind. Vietnamese Americans the least responsive on that issue. Next slide. Immigration, that's going to be discussed later on. Democrats over Republicans among all groups except for Vietnamese Americans. Next slide. Janelle, is this you now?
So I'll continue on here.
Yeah.
All right, so just keep in mind again that these are all registered voters. And we do see some patterns that we've seen in the past. For instance, among all groups, they are more likely to favor a bigger government than a smaller government, with a bigger government with more services and a smaller government with fewer services. And you can see that's true of the Asian American population as a whole. I think this is a critical data point for understanding the Asian American vote and why they have consistently been moving towards the Democrats. In terms of healthcare for all immigrants, so this is an immigrant rights question as well as a healthcare question, we see that Asian Americans are more likely to agree strongly or somewhat with expanding access to health insurance for all immigrants, regardless of legal status. Again, similar to what we've seen in some of these past slides, Asian Indians tend to be the most progressive on this issue. Chinese are more split on this issue, but still show strong support for this kind of policy. In terms of a pathway to citizenship, we see that Asian Americans as a whole, over almost 60% agree that undocumented immigrants should have the opportunity to eventually become US citizens, and we see a similar kind of ethnic breakdown here. Again, we're not going to go into detail on all of the different national origin groups, and these slides will be made available after this presentation. In terms of climate change, oftentimes Asian Americans are left out of the discussion about environmental voters, but in fact we see that this remains a really important issue for Asian Americans, and one in which they look pretty different from the general population. They're actually more progressive, so the vast majority agree that Congress and the president should pass stronger legislation to reduce the effects of climate change. We also split wording with global warming. This issue only seems to be getting more important over time. In terms of gun control, Asian Americans are gun control voters, and you can see that here, that almost over 80% agree that we should have stronger gun control laws in the United States. And again, there's some variation, but on the whole, we see that even the group least likely to support gun control, over 70%, so that's Filipino Americans, support stricter gun control laws. When we turn to more specific issues to this election, we asked about whether or not Asian American voters, registered voters, were worried about the possibility of election interference. And you can see here that over half are indeed worried about the possibility of election interference. We also asked about race and discrimination and other issues related to addressing racism in the United States. Here we can see the level of discrimination that people believe Asian Americans face in particular. And you can see that while the plurality of Asian Americans believe that Asian Americans face at least some discrimination, and 23% believe that they face a lot, Korean Americans and Chinese Americans are the groups that are most likely to report high levels of discrimination. In addition, we can see that Asian Americans on the whole are convinced that Black Americans face a lot, or at least some, discrimination. And there's some variation, but it tends to be a consistent recognition among Asian Americans. We also asked about Muslims and discrimination against religiously distinct groups. And you can see here that most Asian Americans believe that Muslims face a high degree of discrimination, or at least some discrimination in US society. This is highest among Indians and lowest among Vietnamese. And these are tied, of course, to these understandings of discrimination and racial discrimination, religiously based discrimination are based on, also feed into people's ideas about what interventions need to happen. So here you can see that the vast majority of Asian Americans believe that the government should do more to give Blacks equal rights with whites. This is again very prominent and strongly agreed with among Asian Indians, and Vietnamese and Chinese demonstrate slightly lower levels, but still majorities believe that the government should play some role here. In terms of pressing issues around policing, here we see that Asian Americans on the whole agree that local governments should shift spending from law enforcement to other kinds of programs. So over half say that they agree with reallocating police funds, and we see very similar kinds of ethnic breakdowns here. In terms of affirmative action, here we asked about affirmative action programs generally, but in the realm of higher education, and you can see that Asian Americans as a whole, we've seen this number over and over again over time. About 70% of Asian American registered voters on the whole support affirmative action in higher education. This level of support is highest among Asian Indians and Vietnamese, who, as you recall, were more Republican leaning, and lowest among Chinese, who have been most prominent in the in opposition towards affirmative action. You can see here still a majority say that they favor affirmative action. 25% say they oppose. We can also look at more deeply at COVID-related challenges with regards to our community. So healthcare, as Karthik mentioned, continues to be a major issue for Asian Americans. And you can see here that over 50% worry that they will not be able to afford the healthcare that they need. This is a worry that Asian Indians express most often, as well as Chinese Americans. Korean Americans, who actually have the lowest levels of insurance, are expressing slightly lower levels of worry here. In terms of hate crimes related to COVID, anti-Asian bias, we see that more than 50% are also worried about these kinds of experiences, with Asian Indians expressing the highest levels, which is interesting since the attention has been on East Asians with regard to anti-Asian bias. Vietnamese expressing the lowest levels of worry here. And we also asked about whether or not people were facing economic precarity. Here we see that about 1 out of every 4 Asian Americans say that either they or someone in their household had to receive financial help in the last 12 months, or a third have had to support their family members. Almost 1 in 5 say that they were not able to pay a monthly bill. This is particularly high among Korean and Filipino Americans, and least likely among Japanese. About 1 in every 4 Asian Americans say that they have had to delay visiting a doctor or a medical professional in the last 12 months. And you can see that this is really high among certain groups, especially Filipino Americans. So I will end it there and turn it over to Christine to provide some additional context.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Christine Chen. I'm Executive Director for Asian and Pacific Islander America Vote. We are so excited to help spearhead the 5th National Asian American Voter Survey and to really ensure that we continue efforts to provide pivotal data on the Asian American electorate. Since 2012, the survey has been conducted for the midterm and presidential election years. In an effort to fill a lack of data on Asian American voters, this survey has been a vital tool in educating campaigns, researchers, voters, and the public. APIAVote is the only national nonpartisan organization whose sole mission is to mobilize all Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in electoral and civic engagement. We provide year-round integrated voter engagement and electoral training to local and state-based community organizations across the country, regardless of ethnic identity. Heading into the 2020, we knew that Asian American voters would be highly motivated, building upon the success of the midterm elections, where voter turnout increased among Asians by 13 percentage points, or a 49% increase since 2014. As a result, Asian Americans are poised to be a margin of victory in several competitive states, including Arizona, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. We must also remember the down ballot races where the voters are key to winning in congressional races in Southern California, including Orange County, Texas 22, in the Houston area, as well as other regions. At the same time, 14% of Asian Americans registered voters remain undecided, with 22% of Chinese Americans also saying that they are undecided. These elections cannot afford to leave any votes up for grabs. Over half of the survey voters have yet to be contacted by either major party, proving that campaigns must invest resources in outreach through translated mail, phone, text, and even no-touch literature drops. Every cycle, we reach Asian American voters who are unaware of what is on their ballot, since no one has engaged this growing base of immigrant voters. Political parties and campaigns have 7 weeks to change this. But if these institutions invest early on and continue the engagement after the elections, this can pay off for them long term. After all, we all have a little over a quarter of the community who still do not identify with a political party. Regardless of this, APIAVote and the network of community-based organizations, where later on you will hear from some of them, span 28 states, are known trusted messengers who are ready to flex their muscles. And we see this election cycle as another opportunity to reclaim our voice on issues that we care about. Our network is actively organizing to address and provide assistance to Asian voters who have diverse language and cultural needs that are rarely met. The Asian American electorate faces greater barriers to voting in 2020 with the fear of anti-Asian violence, COVID-19 infection, and confusion about how to vote. With 77% of Asian households in battleground states reporting that they speak a language other than English, we are prioritizing sending translated state-specific mailers to over 700,000 Asian American and Pacific Islander households. Janelle, if you just scroll back, then that way they can see the mailers again. This is an example of some of the content will be on the mailers. They are a key component in making sure that Asian American voters are able to navigate through the different methods and options regarding voting, whether it is by mail, voting early, or going to the polls on election day. When coupled with phone banking and texting by community volunteers who have strong community networks, we're able to make sure voters who need language assistance and are traditionally ignored by general outreach efforts turn out at the polls. This is especially critical today when 54% of Asian American voters plan on voting by mail or by absentee, which is consistent with the Asian participation rate in states such as California, where vote by mail is a common option. Next week, we will be celebrating National Voter Registration Day. As a reminder, this all starts with a call to action among our own family and friends. It is as easy as reaching out to 10 of your friends to text AAPI to 788-683 to begin the process of registering to vote. On the next slide, you'll see if you want to do more, but unsure how to get started, join APIAVote's relational organizing campaign by simply going to our outreach circle links on the screens to get started and to reach and to be provided different action alerts every week. There is so much at stake in the 2020 elections. The proof is in the data, which shows Asian American voters are not only invested in several hot button issues, but also invested in the outcome of the elections. Campaigns, legislators, researchers, and advocacy groups must take note of the Asian American electorate and make sure they are given the resources and the support they need to cast an educated ballot this November. Thank you. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to John Yang, who's President and CEO of Asian American Advancing Justice, AAJC.
Great. Thank you very much, Christine. And thank you all for participating in this. It's wonderful to partner with APIAVote and AAPI Data on this continuing series of surveys of the Asian American community and really to highlight some of these issues. One of the beauties of these surveys is that since we have been doing them since 2012, we really have benchmarks from which to work and see the progression with respect to how Asian Americans look at some of these different issues. We at Advancing Justice AAJC really focus on the policy advocacy aspect, whether it is on census, on immigration, on voter protection, or on immigration. And the focus here is to understand, using this data, how we best advocate for our community, how we best protect our community, and how we best talk to policymakers about the needs and interests of our community. Let me just highlight a few specific pieces of data with respect to what we saw in this most recent survey and highlight the relevance to everyone. And certainly our hope is to engage in questions and dialogue with all of you about some of these issues. So if we could go to the next slide. And hopefully Janelle is operating, or someone, thank you. First thing I want to talk about is voting. You know, obviously this is front and center in everyone's mind. And I want to highlight one statistic, which is that 54% of our community plans to vote by mail or by absentee. Now, to be clear, voting by mail and voting by absentee typically legally is the same thing. I know there's a lot of talk about what that means. Both of them are the same mechanism of delivery. Another 44% plan to vote in person or to vote early, going to a polling place, going to an administrative center to vote early. What is important about this data also is that about 1 in 3 Asian Americans polled said that using a language assistant would be very helpful and critical to their ability to cast a ballot. And frankly, in some ways, that statistic is unsurprising because of the fact that we know from other data, specifically from the census, that about 1/3 of our population is limited English proficient. So what does that mean? There's 2 things to be aware of. And I saw a question earlier about this. There's about 27 jurisdictions in the United States where it is mandated that the ballots be accessible in one other Asian language. That is determined by something that's called the Voting Rights Act, that if there's a certain percentage or a certain number of individuals that speak a different language in that jurisdiction, they must provide that ballot in that language. The second aspect is what's called Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act. That allows anyone to bring an assister of their choice to the ballot box to help them in casting a ballot. And what that means is that if you do not feel proficient in English, you could bring along someone. It does not even have to be a voting citizen. Rather, it is simply anyone that can help you navigate the ballot box process. I put in the chat box resources for this understanding of Section 203 and 208. The other thing that I would offer that people can use is a hotline that we, along with APIAVote, run at APIAVote that really provides resources and information about this voting process. The second thing that I want to highlight is some of the issues that are important to all of us. And if we can move to the next slide. First and foremost, and this is a place of contention that we are seeing in the news and that we will see tomorrow, which is that Asian Americans support affirmative action. An overwhelming majority by 70% in support to only 16% against, with the other approximate 14% either undecided or don't know. Now, let me put that into context. When we did the similar polls in 2016 and 2018, going back to 2016, the percentage in favor was 64%. The percentage opposed is 25%. So not only do we see an increase in the support for affirmative action, but we see a decrease in opposition. And this is a trend that continued in 2018 and continues to this day. The other aspect of that is that even for Chinese Americans, which we admittedly have been pretty vocal opponents of affirmative action, even within the Chinese American community, 59% support as opposed to 30% which oppose. So still, even there, it's a 2-to-1 ratio. And that's important because we see the media reports that somehow Chinese Americans, Asian Americans oppose affirmative action. that we are somehow a wedge between the communities. And we must make sure to be clear that that is not the case, that the polling has consistently demonstrated that that's not the case. A couple of other important issues to mention. One would be immigration, and that number one, Asian Americans rank immigration as an extremely important issue. That's understandable, considering that over 90% of our population are either immigrants or children of immigrants. But what that includes is support for undocumented immigrants having a path to citizenship. And that, again, is supported by a large majority of our population. Likewise, immigration status does not matter when it comes to supporting health coverage for everyone. And that is something that we see across the board with respect to Asian Americans as well. So these are other places where sometimes we are either seen as a wedge issue or we are not seen as at all. Oftentimes immigration is seen as a Latinx issue, and understandably, there should be a focus there, but also there should be a focus on the Asian American population, and this data backs it up. The last thing I would say is with respect to COVID-19. And certainly for the Asian Americans in this audience, we already know many of the statistics. We already know that the impact that this has had. But this data once again shows the real numbers, which is about 3/4 of our population have said that we worry about discrimination because of COVID-19. That's been backed up by a Ipsos poll, that's been backed up by other polls. And this is something that politicians and policymakers should be aware of as we go into the future, as we develop policies around hate incidents, around hate crimes. How do we make sure that the Asian American voice is heard in all of that? Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So to try to keep us on track with time, we'll try to bunch a number of these questions. For those of you asking whether the presentation and the slide deck and the information will be available after this, it will be. There'll be a recording put up as well by APIAVote. There have been a few questions from the audience, both on Facebook and in the Zoom chat, about methodology and whether or not the survey results skew heavily towards California respondents. So Karthik or Janelle, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, and been trying to answer some of these in the chat box as well. The data are weighted, and it's a pretty sophisticated method. It's weighted according to state, by ethnic group, and also by ethnic group according to their education, their nativity, their gender, and their age. So this is whatever the bias that might exist in terms of who enters into our survey, it is corrected through the sophisticated weighting method.
Great, thank you. And then there were some additional questions about longitudinal data over time, especially because there have been past surveys. John, you had mentioned this as well in your remarks about being able to track some of the shifts in attitudes, if you want to speak to that.
Sure. So people could go back to the 2012, 2016, and 2018 AAPI surveys that were conducted by APIAVote and AAPI Data. Advancing Justice AAJC joined in several of those as well. And many of those had the same questions. So you could track the progress of those questions over that period of time. And I think that's one of the beauties of this survey tool that we've been using.
Christine, there are a couple questions related to voter outreach done by the major political parties. And we know that this is an issue that has played a significant role for the community over a number of election cycles. Could you provide a little bit more context there as to what you saw with the survey results?
Right. As you saw from the survey results, there still is a lot of work that needs to be done. But I will say that the parties have throughout the years have gone a lot better. Part of it is that when you have more Asian American Pacific Islanders running as candidates, they're also more conscious about engaging the Asian American electorate and educating their own political party as well as other candidates about the need to do that. We're also seeing an increase of different political PACs that are both active on the Democratic and Republican side, as well as nonprofits that are, especially on the progressive side, that are creating C4s, so that way they can also engage a lot more. But ultimately, it really is about dollars and how much they're investing and not just relying on volunteers. But it's also about hiring staff that looks and reflects our communities.
Very good. And I'll end with a quick fire question to to everyone, but what is for you the most surprising change that you've seen over the past few surveys as a result of the results and sort of changes in attitudes for the community? I'll start with Janelle and then go to Karthik and then John, Christine.
For me, it's the continued support for affirmative action, and there's been so much mobilization and media attention to that issue, but it's interesting to me that the community as a whole has stayed really steady on support for race-conscious admissions.
Yeah, I'll just add a few things. I mean, we have some new, even though we have the longitudinal, we have some new ways of asking questions in terms of solidarity on anti-Black racism and reinvesting, right, from law enforcement to community investment. There's strong support there. And I think that's just really important, looking at this context of our racial order, that Asian Americans are firmly on the side of racial justice and with our Black brothers and sisters. I think that's important to flag. There has been a shift. So if you look among Vietnamese Americans, we saw this in 2018 as well. So I think our vote is not a lock in any means. And I think this just means that the parties and campaigns, including issue campaigns, have to pay attention to our communities, including those working on environmental issues and gun control. I can't tell you the number of times people just have these stereotypes in terms of these issues as not being Asian American issues, and we have to change that. Hopefully these multiple data points will finally convince people of that.
I think for me, it actually even predates this data, which is that Asian Americans have made a huge shift with respect to party identification, with respect to the presidential candidate that they vote for. Back in 1992, a fairly significant majority of Asian Americans voted for then President H.W. Bush. And obviously we've seen a very, very significant shift since then. I think Janelle is disagreeing with that, but
no, she's laughing because I sneezed.
Oh, sorry. But it has been a significant shift. And so I think that is something that we all should be looking at.
You know, overall, I'm just excited to see that the excitement and that there's the large percentage, the majority of the voters polled are very much energized for this election. And we're also seeing, just even hearing from the field, that it's not just about the presidential elections, but people understand and are connecting the dots about the importance of down the ballot, the candidates that are down the ballot, and that we need to pay attention to local elections. Part of it is, I believe, is because what we're experiencing right now in 2020. People are tuning in every single day to figure out if their kid is going to be able to go to school, and the decisions that are being made by elected officials impact their lives every single day. And they're finally connecting those dots and taking that to the polls.
Great, thank you all. It's now my pleasure to introduce our next panel of speakers. We'll now hear from a number of community organizers, community organizations to provide that perspective to these survey results. So it's my pleasure to introduce now the Executive Director of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, Alvina Ye. Alvina?
Great, thank you so much, Greg, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this press conference. So I represent the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. We're a member-led organization that works to build power for Asian American and Pacific Islander working people. And we do this through our grassroots and civic engagement-based campaigns around immigrant, racial, and economic justice. So I'm a big data geek. I'm very excited about this survey. It's something I always look forward to every election year. And in 2018, Apollo was a proud partner in that survey and was able to get some questions in there about workplace issues. But for this year's survey, I really appreciate the confirmation that the Asian American community is growing some consciousness, and not growing some, it has consciousness around race, is engaging in this conversation around racial inequity, and there is a desire to be in solidarity with other communities of color. You know, the data also confirms for me what we already know, that many crises that our country is dealing with, the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, racial inequity, the economic crisis, these are all very top of mind for our community and have really underscored the need for change and accountable leadership at every level of government. So voters aren't just energized by this election, but I think it's really the energy of the urgency of the state that our country is in right now. And I'm seeing that through things like places I've never seen action before: Facebook cooking groups, family text threads, people that haven't really been engaged before are now understanding more and more the need to talk about, engage, and even to organize, not just in the election, but anywhere they can, like through donations and sharing articles and all things like that. So, you know, what I'm excited by is that our community, in some ways, many new folks are looking for an organizing home, a chance to make a difference in the community, and they want to be able to do that with people that they can build power with, that they trust, that are in their community. The other thing that we're hearing through APALA is that AAPIs want more than just a good job, and we want to build a powerful movement that links all of the different pieces that AAPI workers live in terms of their life, and we want to fight for all these things that our community needs to thrive. And there's a lot at stake. So, you know, that I'm really heartened by in terms of the survey. You know, the thing about mainstream parties not reaching our communities, that's not new news. And so it's really, really important the work that our members have been doing. You know, in California, for example, our chapters up and down the state formed a political committee to organize around ballot measures like Prop 15, which closes the corporate tax loopholes, which would then reclaim $12 billion in funds for schools and community initiatives. You know, they're also fighting for affirmative action and racial equity through supporting Prop 16. In Texas, our Vietnamese members have been calling other Vietnamese community members to check on them during this time and to talk to them about the census and voting. And in states like Michigan, Texas, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, many of our chapters and community partner organizations are working with other constituency groups on a joint plan to register, educate, and turn out LGBTQ folks, women, and other communities of color. I'll underscore what others have said before around in-language organizing being more important than ever. We've been doing our relational organizing, our phone and our text banking in many languages, and many of our written materials are also in many AA and PI languages as well. The thing about voting by mail is also really heartening. That's something that we've been playing around during the primary election, asking people to request their mail-in ballots, and really understanding that the rules and deadlines are shifting around this all the time. It's not clear, so we're spending a lot more time on voter education and making sure that people know how to request their ballot and turn it in. And then the other thing I'll add is we're also working on a letter writing campaign. So for those that we don't have emails and phone numbers for, making sure that we're getting people who we might usually have been able to touch through a door knock. So we're doing a lot, very excited about the work that we're doing, but I want to turn it over to some of our other partners. You can learn more about the work that we're doing, and anyone can join and be a member of APALA. Our website is www.apalanet.org. I'll drop the link in the chat where you can find out more about the work that we're doing, sign up to volunteer, and we also have lots of great stories about AAPI essential workers and what's at stake for them in this election. So I'm going to turn it now back to Greg.
Great, thank you so much, Alvina. And to the press on the line, there are definitely fantastic stories happening at the local level of the Asian American community being mobilized, and to community members, get involved. Our next speaker is Nancy Nguyen from Viet Lead. Nancy, go ahead.
Hi, folks. Thanks, Christine, for inviting me to join the panel. The survey and listening to the results is actually really interesting and exciting. My name is Nancy Nguyen. I am the Executive Director of Viet Lead. I go by she, her. Our organization does, amongst other things, C3 electoral organizing in the Vietnamese and Southeast Asian community in Philadelphia for the past 5 years now. I think just to say, you know, working in Philadelphia and working with other groups in Pennsylvania, I feel like a lot of what was reflected in the survey rings true to us. A couple of points that I want to put out is, you know, even though I think like because there's so much there's so much media echo chambers around different candidates. Actually, when we talk to our folks about issues and the issues they care about and the issues that they want to see movement on, that's where folks are actually moving. I think for a long time, you know, even though Viet Lead focuses on the Vietnamese community, we understand that to move anything in Philadelphia, you actually have to be able to move power at the state level. And so over the last year and a half, we worked with a number, 13 other Asian American groups, including APALA's Philadelphia and APALA's Pittsburgh chapter, to form a coalition called the AAPI Power Caucus. These are 13 Asian American organizations that spanned the state from Philadelphia on the southeast Pennsylvania side all the way to Pittsburgh on the western side of Pennsylvania, in order to collectively make an impact on AAPI voters in this election, right? To educate our folks in language about the issues that they care about, right? All of the top line issues that were talked about in the survey, you know, are the issues that our folks care about. Like for Vietnamese folks, our folks care about jobs. And under the pandemic, you know, the reality of job loss, or the reality of where our folks work, right? Like for instance, in Philadelphia, so many of our folks work in factories, in food factories, and are directly impacted by COVID, right? So again, when we talk about our issues, that's where we win. That's where we move people. And so the other point is also the reality that, you know, in this election, we're working together in the Power Caucus to be able to reach out to all of these Asian folks, so South Asian folks, Korean folks, Viet folks, Chinese, Filipino, Burmese folks, who are not being touched by either party, who are independent and who are undecided, right? One data point about Pennsylvania that I think is important to lift up is vote by mail. Actually, in the primaries, it was amongst all communities, actually Asian communities were the ones that registered to vote by mail the most in the state of Pennsylvania. This is both a really good thing and also like something that we're working to educate our communities and to make sure that when they vote by mail, for the general, that they're doing it early, that they're doing it with the language support that they need. And so I just really encourage anybody who's listening, who's interested in Pennsylvania and who's interested in moving the needle in Pennsylvania and the API community to reach out to us as well. We can connect you with any of the other organizations in the Power Caucus. You can look us up on Facebook, on Instagram, vietlead.org. But again, I really appreciate this issue survey. I think that the final thing is that I'll say is it is something to be dealt. I saw one of the questions, like, you know, why are Vietnamese folks still voting like for the Republican Party, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, again, you know, the one place that we need to figure out how to do voter education is actually with our ethnic media. So a lot of the misinformation and disinformation we're seeing is actually coming from ethnic media and the echo chambers that are created there and on social media, on YouTube, on Facebook. And so this is an area of work that we, you know, at Viet Lead want to work with other Vietnamese organizations to offer alternatives in terms of where folks can find language accessible media sources. Because the reality is, for example, the Vietnamese community is majority limited English proficient. So for so many people, like their major source of information is going to be Vietnamese news. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Nancy. And I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Debbie Chen from OCA Greater Houston. Debbie, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for having me. Hearing everyone speak in the data is wonderful. OCA Greater Houston is a part of a national social justice, civil rights, advocacy, leadership, and education organization. And here in Houston, a large part of our focus is developing young people, future leaders, to make sure that they understand the issues that impact AAPIs as they go forward in their lives. And our programs are targeted for every life stage of people's lives, so that we have a variety of programs, everything from, you know, cooking shows to senior holiday baskets, which this year, because of COVID, we're not going to be able to do. But we also do youth organizing regularly year-round with high school students and with college students. So for this year, the majority of our work actually has been a mix of census and GeoTV together. We have limited resources, and so we wanted to get the most bang for our buck, and so we've been doing both at the same time. So for us, by November 1st, we will have literature dropped over 300,000 homes, doors, targeting not just AAPI doors, but especially in the apartment complexes here in the greater Houston area. We're targeting all immigrants, people of color, low-income people. Everyone who's going to be impacted essentially by not being counted by the census, and the importance of getting everyone to go out and vote and or find out information on how to become a citizen, because we do monthly forums to provide citizenship assistance. We're also doing a digital campaign reaching over 500,000 AAPI voters, and we're participating in the mailers that AAPIAVote has organized, targeting 65,000 low propensity as well as some high propensity voters here in the greater Houston area. We're organizing candidate forums with our other community partners here in the AAPI community. We are targeting all AAPIs. We are not focused on any particular ethnicity. We've helped to put together Chinese and Vietnamese voter guides, as well as conducting phone banking and texting. We will be reaching over 150,000 potential AAPI voters. And so we hope that our efforts will turn out more people. I also want to just say briefly that it's not just the greater Houston area, but it is a coordinated effort statewide. Houston, Dallas, and Austin are the three major cities with the largest populations of AAPIs in Texas. And so our partner groups, the Austin Asian Community Civic Coalition, as well as Save Texas Education Fund, we're also doing targeted mailers, targeting over 25,000 unregistered potential AAPI voters, sending them voter registration cards with postage paid return mails, as well as doing voter guides in Central Texas, texting campaigns, phone banking, and then a voter registration action day that will be targeting an additional 10,000 potential voters.
Thanks, Debbie. So we'll take a couple questions because we are getting close to time. Going back to Karthik, Janelle, John, or Christine, there was a question about the survey results being accessible in other languages. Are you able to speak to that?
So for that, I think we'll have to rely on our partners. And Christine, let's discuss with APIAVote and AAJC. At the very least, I think we could make the press release and other material. But in the past, we've relied on our ethnic media partners to be able to disseminate that, that information.
Great, thank you. And then a question from
Questionnaire was available. Oh, sorry, and the questionnaire was available in Korean, Vietnamese, Chinese, and one other language.
No, those are the languages. So 2 versions of Chinese, but yes.
Thanks, Janelle. So there's a question from Karen Narasaki about a little bit of a deeper dive into the Vietnamese American responses as it relates to COVID relief. Certainly it lines up with some of the anecdotal evidence we've seen as far as community impact and small business impact. Is there anyone who could speak to sort of what they saw in the survey results there?
We need to go back and see, but like I said, the economic, some of the economic impacts showed through, right? And I should note, it's not just small business, right? I mean, a lot of times we talk about the small businesses, let's talk about the employees in those businesses. And that's where we're seeing a lot of the economic pain. And I think that's, you know, that's going to be important, I think, regardless, going beyond this election. We are seeing evidence from multiple sources in terms of how different Asian American communities and certainly Pacific Islander communities have been so adversely affected, and we need to make sure that that their that their needs are being addressed. I'm seeing a bunch of questions in terms of where people can find our crosstabs and press release, etc. It's going to be on all of the websites. We're updating as we speak on APIData.com, but you'll find it at APIAVote.org, as well as Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC.
Great. And maybe a question for John and Christine from Terry Tang from, I believe, the Associated Press. Do you know if the growth in Asian American voters in swing states and states considered previously more red, such as Arizona or Nevada, is attributed to more to immigrants than, say, births or transplants?
I mean, if you look at the growth rate, you really do need to see that the immigrant population is playing a large role with that. But, you know, it always goes back to the issues. You know, the voters are voting based on their values and the issues that they stand on. And so when a campaign, whether it's a ballot initiative or political parties, is able to articulate an outreach to this community, they could really get them to support their cause. Maybe Debbie, who's from a southern state, would like to also comment.
Well, Texas is a unique state, and you know, Houston, as a result of COVID, I'll give one example. We had a candidate, a Republican candidate during the primaries, running TV ads saying that the Chinese are here to poison people. That hit a really big nerve in the Chinese American community, where you had a lot of questions going back and forth on WeChat and within the community about, you know, is this an administration that's really looking out for the interests of Chinese and Chinese Americans? And so I think that's something that's going to play a factor, right? It was a galvanizing point for multiple organizations to come together and do a campaign together to show how Asian Americans are here supporting local hospitals and frontline workers. Whereas before it was just every group doing it on their own. Things like that galvanize people to actually work together. I definitely think there are many different issues and instances that are happening here in Texas that are going to increase turnout this year.
Very good. I see a question from Nicholas Wu from USA Today. Did you see any regional variation in the data on partisan leanings or presidential choice?
Could you repeat the question, Greg?
Sure. Did you see any regional variation in the data on partisan leanings or presidential choice?
So we do have data by geography and state electoral college rating. And what's interesting is that in the red states and the blue states, you're seeing strong favorability. I mean, Biden has a much bigger advantage, and it's pretty much even when you look at it in battleground states. And that might be surprising. You might ask why you wouldn't expect that. You might see more even in the red states. But Texas, depending on the way we looked at various summary statistics, we see that Texas is a battleground this year. And it is going to be a fight in Texas with all the Asian American populations, including, you know, just looking at the Indian American population. You had a Howdy Modi rally where President Trump attended. So the vote in Texas is very much up for grabs, not only in the Indian American community, but other Asian American communities as well.
In addition, for Texas, you have two Asian American congressional candidates. So that's also raising a lot of awareness and engagement as well.
Great. John, why don't we close with you? I saw earlier in the question chat, there was a really good question or point about
John had to leave, Greg, just let you know.
John is gone, so maybe I'll pose it to you, Christine, since you spoke up. There's a great question about ethnic communities tending to do better when they stand united as a voting bloc or as sort of a representative of their community. And so the question was, based on the data provided around attitudes towards social justice, racial equity, the safety net, things like that, what's your take on all of that? As the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community is incredibly diverse, how do we move forward?
Yeah, we always get that question, and culturally and language-wise, it may differ, but when it comes to the values and how, and you can see it in the data in itself in terms of how they're answering what they support in terms of a wide variety of issues. They are trending a lot more progressive. I know Janelle and Karthik could talk a little bit more diving into that, but I mean, that has been consistent from what we've seen year after year on all these surveys.
Great. So I think we're just at time. I know there are a number of questions, and maybe there are questions after you have a chance to review the data. I know all of the participants would be happy to field more questions from you all. Contact information should have been shared through the press release or the media advisory. Thank you especially to API Data, APIAVote, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, for being the leads on this important survey results. Thank you to our local speakers for always doing the work that you do on the ground and helping contextualize a lot of this national conversation that needs to happen. Appreciate everyone for attending and look forward to working with all of you to make sure that the Asian American community is heard from in the upcoming election cycle. Thank you all.